So, welcome. We are now in our new church history course, a new church history subsection, really, of the course Christ Church Through the Ages, this popular history course, of course, going through the ecclesiastical history of the church and the surrounding events thereof. We, of course, spent 37 lessons going through the patristic era, the early church, from the apostles to Augustine. It's the shorthand way of remembering it. And now we're moving on to the medieval world. And so this lesson, which is numbered 38 in the overall series, is part one on the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Okay, what we're going to do, pardon me, is spend this lesson and the next lesson conducting a very general 30,000-foot flyby of a concourse of events, because it's not really a singular event, but a concourse of events that we broadly refer to as the fall of the Western Roman Empire, or some people just usually simply know it as the fall of the Roman Empire, anachronistically. That, if we were to do in much more specific play-by-play form, would be a dozen plus lessons at least. So what we're going to be doing is simply using this time period of the 5th century AD for context. Okay. Today is much generally shorter and, again, less detailed. It's more about what on earth happened just in its basic details. Next week, which would be part 2, okay, on this specific portion, the fall of the Western Roman Empire, we'll be going into more some of the direct contemporary quotations which we have, which, of course, overwhelmingly come from church sources during that time, including St. Augustine himself, most famously in his work, Civitas Dei, the City of God. We'll be talking about that, not going through the whole work, but talking about that, talking about others at this time as well. So you can almost, in a general sense, I am speaking generally, think of it as today, part 1 being the what, and in the next lesson, part 2 being the why, as it were. And so we're wanting to reflect on what happened, but more importantly, what the contemporary views, especially among Christians, was, not exclusively, but especially among the Christians at that time in the western half of the world. And the two reasons for doing that is much akin to how we actually spent 6 lessons going through the ancient Greco-Roman world, in which the time of the apostles then arrives in the New Testament church, as it were. You need to understand some of the pretext and the cultural kind of lead-in in order to understand where people were at that specific time, or this specific time, or whatever it is. Because the reality is that the fall of the Western Roman Empire, as we call it, and we'll explain that more in just a moment, what we mean by that, is one of the most defining concourse of events in the history of the world. It is something which has shaped the European world, and by extension the rest of the world, even to this very day, okay, in ways that may not even be obvious on the surface. It is something which had a deep, lasting and profound impact upon the churches around the world, and something which, again, also to this day still has that flow and impact. And it's something which, in order to kind of see the bright, shining lights that we'll be looking at, especially as we are in the early Middle Ages, which is what this first portion is going to be in the broader scope of the Middle Ages, you need to be able to understand it in the backdrop of it, of the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Okay, so what are we generally speaking referring to with that? Sorry, next one. In 395, the Roman Empire, as we understand it, usually in general terms, has a formal provincial or administrative split. Okay, this is not the first time necessarily that the Roman Empire has been ruled by multiple emperors. In fact, there's been a number of other instances, like during the days of the crisis of the 3rd century, which, as its name suggests, was a crisis that happened in the 3rd century. You also had, at the beginning of the 4th century, so the beginning of the 300s, the Tetrarchy, so 4 different emperors ruling over 4 different subdivisions of the one empire, the Roman Empire. But in essence, what we're talking about here is the very end of the 4th century, of course, on the dawn of that of the 5th. And This is following the death of a man which we learnt about during our early church history course, especially around the Second Ecumenical Council, and that is the Christian Roman Emperor Theodosius the Great. He reigned as the unified emperor, the last unified emperor of Rome, from 379 to 395. Okay? And it's upon his death in 395, in the lead up there too, that he formally appoints his successors, in this case plural. He grants the imperium of the eastern provinces, which you can see in purple before you on the right side, obviously the east side, to his son Arcadius, and he grants and appoints the western provinces in the red on the map in front of you to his other son Honorius, with H, Honorius, Honorius, right, or Honorius. So Honorius, in the emperor of the west, Arcadius, emperor of the east, the two sons of Theodosius the Great. Okay, this is well into the time period of the Christian Roman emperors. Okay, so the last pagan Roman emperor, Julian the Apostate, who we looked at as well in our previous course, reigned, fortunately, very briefly from 361 to 363. Paganism among the emperors has, thank God, ended. Pardon me. And now the emperors are Christian, right, and quite devoutly and faithfully Christian. They are a bulwark in many respects against the flood of Arianism, which, of course, as we know from the first two ecumenical councils, the Council of Nicaea in 325 and the Council of Constantinople, which has become the new capital and now resides, of course, there in the Eastern Roman Empire, as we refer back to it, were central in dealing with the Arian heresy. But one thing that you're going to learn, especially as we come to kind of lesson 40 and onward, into the 6th century and the definitive kind of early days of what we call now the Middle Ages, that the Arian heresy is still very much alive and kicking. Okay, it's been formally kind of cut off at the knees, so to speak, or decapitated, we might say, in terms of from a theological perspective. It's been firmly dealt with. The lines in the sand have been very clearly drawn, if that makes sense. But Arianism still flourishes significantly because of the fact that there were Arian ministers, Arian acolytes, who went and evangelized into Arianism, as it were, who proselytized into Arianism many of the Germanic tribes of the north, beyond the Rhine. So much, if you've looked there, and we'll zoom in, so if you just, next slide for me, to show you a bit closer up for you in terms of what was the Western Roman Empire, as we now again retroactively refer back. Much of those borders in the heartland of Europe there are running along major rivers like the Rhine, for example. Okay, and the Germanic tribes, various different kinds, which we're going to encounter quite a lot from various different portions: the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Burgundians, the Lombardians. All these names will become more familiar to you if you're not already familiar with them. Resided on those sides. They are the descendants of the Germanic peoples whom the Romans have been, proverbially from their perspective, keeping at bay for quite a while, for centuries. Okay, they begin to adopt Arianism en masse, which is quite a twist of irony, having previously obviously just believed their more ancient indigenous Germanic paganism in its various different varieties, had actually converted in increasing numbers, including especially among some of the kings, the chieftains, away from Germanic paganism and into Arianism, okay? Particularly among the Goths, which were different branches which will become very prominent as we go through. But nevertheless, this is the kind of scenario that is beginning to unfold. The empire is formally split into what we now refer back to as Western Roman Empire and Eastern Roman Empire, right? Obviously, throughout this time, I'll be using modern terminology for how we refer back to it, because in those days, say, for example, the Eastern Roman Empire, which you probably know better as the Byzantine Empire, just simply referred to themselves as the Imperium Romanum, the Roman Empire, okay? Because they were the continuation, Hellenized as it was, Greekified as it was, they were the continuation of the eastern provinces of the empire, right? Nevertheless, during this time, we're now into the split empire, we're into the early 5th century, You have emperor in the west, emperor in the east, the two sons of Theodosius the Great. There's a number of successors after them, back and forth. And during this time, Rome is entering a very visible period of decline, okay? Particularly, albeit not exclusively, but particularly in the west, which is what you see before you on screen or on your notes there. In the west, we have this example, okay? During this time, and you can see there, even if I just elaborate a bit further, of course, up there in the northwest off the northern coast of Europe, you have the Roman province of Britannia, right? Roman Britain, okay? The Romans invaded Britain in 43, 44 AD. Took them about 40 years or so to eventually conquer the Britons, but then from that point onward, 400 years of the Roman province there. From that point onward, this is where this is going to become vital to understand. Again, we're just speaking in general histories here. The first of these to start to crumble is actually the Roman province of Britannia. In 383, you have a general called Maximus, known in the ancient world as Maxen Uledig, Maximus the Emperor, Maximus the King, Maximus the Great. He himself, Maximus Aemilianus, he leads a rebellion and proclaims himself Emperor of Britannia and Gaul. Gaul is modern-day France. And the empire begins to fracture once again. That goes and comes and goes again. You have the evacuation of the island formally. In the early 400s, Rome is starting to shrink. It realizes it can't actually maintain these expansive territories, and so they eventually evacuate the island. This is just one example, and I'm condensing a lot of history there, but obviously. This is one example of what is starting to happen. The empire, which had stood for centuries, built out of the corpse, as it were, of the republic which preceded it, 500 years before that, is fading, okay? People are observant of this, and this is why we're wanting to, again, much to the introduction, we're not just simply wanting to learn facts and details, we're wanting to more learn these events of history through the eyes of real people who lived it, especially Christians, okay? Which, as I said, is going to be much more of the focus next week in terms of this event, of the fall of the Roman Empire. But people are anxious, people are scared, pagan and Christian alike. The population itself is heavily fragmented between pagan and Christian. There is millions of Christians at this point, in fact usually tens of millions, across both the east and the west. And indeed, there are also still tens of millions of those who have held out the advance of Christianity. There is a massive and exponentially at this point increasing gap between the patrician and plebeian classes, in other words, the wealthy land-owning classes of the patricians, as they were known in Roman culture, and the commons, okay, known as the plebeians. Right? Plebeians could be wealthy and powerful, but the division between those two has basically kicked into hyperdrive. Okay? You've heard me quote before from various historical sources, even in the days of the end of the Republic, about how there was no heart left among any of the plebeians to fight for Rome. There was no desire because of the fact that the patricians had either taken their land, had bought it out from underneath them, had done what would often increasingly occur and was actually very common now, where Roman soldiers would be, as part of the normal deal or the benefits of enlisting in the Roman army, you serve your 25 years in the army, in the legions, and you then retire to a plot of land and a vineyard and household servants and whatever the deal, whatever the actual makeup was, depending on where you're talking about. Well, of course, many of those soldiers, and eventually the majority of those soldiers, retired after 25 years of loyal service to their beloved people to find that there was no land because the patricians had bought it up on the cheap, or they'd taken it, or they had just simply flooded it with foreign slaves from North Africa for cheap labour. Okay? And there was nothing to be found for the citizens of Rome anymore, is actually one direct quote from the days of the Republic. It had already been like that since the 1st century BC, but it was especially true now for almost 500 years later. This is an empire that is crumbling and fading. It's an empire whose territories it conquered largely during the days of the Republic and had held these territories for 600, 700, in some places almost 800 years. Okay? It's fracturing, fragmenting, there's hyperinflation, the economy is just yo-yoing and going back and forth. The patrician and political class in general, among the senators, are filled with greed and avarice and have little to no care for any of the affairs of their people. And if you're worried that I'm talking about Australia, I'm still talking about the Roman Empire, because the line between the two is virtually impossible to distinguish. But that being smart, part of a big reason, I know I crack a joke there, but as a brief aside, part of the reason for wanting to at least give a broad what and a more detailed why into the fall of the Western Roman Empire is because of how many people are noticing the eerie similarities between the collapse of the Roman Empire and the fall of Western nations at our time, or the decline, if I was to be a bit more euphemistic. Because in many respects, not completely universally, because this still does exist 1,500 years ago, and the world is very different from what it was 1,500 years ago, in many respects, especially technologically. But general factors, politically, economically, ethnically and otherwise, are eerily similar, or in some cases actually just straight the same. They are the foundational hallmarks of the collapse or decline, the fall, as we might generally say, in historical terms, of a civilization. Okay? That does not necessitate the ending or the extinction of a people, not necessarily, but certainly the collapse of a civilization like Rome. Because Rome, it's been a very, very, very long time since Rome was just a city on 7 hills on the Tiber River. Right? Rome is a civilization, a whole civilization, which conquered the world. Right? Conquered the oikumene, as it was referred to in by the Greeks. Right? Conquered the inhabited world. They conquered everything from Britannia to Babylon. Right? Every single square inch, even before especially before these days, of the entire Mediterranean coastline was under Roman control. Rome had conquered every meaningful people that had ever come before them that was of any note, right? Save for maybe the Persianate societies, but they were a shadow of their former self. They were the top of the world. They were the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. They were the most prosperous, ordered, lawful, mightiest civilization that the ancient world ever knew, which is, of course, why its renown and fame has echoed throughout the ages. But that is, as I say, now crumbling and collapsing. You have, and this is one of the more important kind of figures to understand, the beginning from at least the early 4th century, so almost 100 years before we were talking about, all the way through to the end of the 5th century itself. You have this 200-year period, which at least in the most general or the broadest sense, kind of 300 to 500 AD, if we're being loose, of what we call what's called often the migration period, which is usually a bit of a euphemistic way of saying the invasion period. The invasions and or migrations of the Germanic peoples of Northern Europe down into the Mediterranean world. Okay? And these are the ancestors of what will become various different peoples, from the French to at least part of the Italians, mainly in the north, to, of course, the modern nation-states of Germany and Austria, and other such places, of course, coming even from modern nations of Denmark, Sweden, the English, of course, most famously. In fact, you can see there in the northernmost parts of the map before you, the crossing of the North Sea by the Angles, the Utes and the Saxons, which ultimately end up forming the Anglo-Saxons, the English, the Angleland, the land of the Angles. But what you'll note is the timing on some of these major ones, okay? And you also have a key down the bottom right to understand which group this is talking about. The biggest ones of note during this time are primarily 3, okay? And by this time, what I'm referring to is the late 300s and definitely into the 400s, okay? So essentially, from the death of Theodosius in 395 to the end of the empire in the west in 476 or 480, depending on how you date it, but at least 476. They are, as we know them retroactively, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, and the Vandals. Okay? The last of those groups is actually gives their name to the English word vandalism, okay, to mark up and to deface and to destroy, okay, because of the barnstorming migrations and invasions that they conducted. Of course, they eventuate in the conquest of Carthage and come to rule a kingdom that predominantly rules over, not exclusively, but largely the Western Mediterranean islands, like Malta, Corsica, etc., as well as Roman North Africa. So what today is places like Tunisia and Morocco and Libya as well. The Visigoths, meaning the Western Goths, and the Ostrogoths, the Eastern Goths, had ultimately in centuries prior migrated down from the Baltic Sea and places of the northern Germanic lands, so places like northern Germany, Schleswig-Holstein, Jutland, in other words Denmark, southern Sweden particularly. For anyone who's familiar with Beowulf, you will know, of course, that Beowulf eventually becomes king of the Geats, which is simply another name for the Goths, okay, in the famous Old English story of Beowulf. These are the people who are being referred to, and they have migrations and invasions down into Eastern Europe and the Baltics in the late 300s. From there, for a variety of factors which are irrelevant largely to us, one of which is the actual arrival of an even more terrifying group than the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, who we know as the Huns. Okay, particularly if you'll have heard of Attila the Hun, the great king and warlord of the Huns. They arrive from lands hitherto unknown, somewhere in the Central Asian or Central Eurasian steppe land, very ancient part of the world that stretches from Mongolia to the north of the Black Sea, places like Ukraine. These vast open steppe lands with nary a tree in sight that horse lords wage war upon. That arrival of the Huns from the east drives the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths west in migration and invasion. And you can see, of course, all the different directions they go. Of course, the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths at various different points invade the Italian peninsula. The Visigoths also invade Greece, what we call Greece today, and the Greek peninsula. Not Constantinople itself, but that is actually one of the few invasions of the Eastern Roman empires at the hands of the Visigoths. And they then eventually settle over in the Iberian Peninsula, the Roman province of Hispania, which is where we get the name for the country Spain. Okay? And they form what's called the Visigothic kingdom. We're going to learn more about the Visigothic kingdom a couple of centuries later when we come to the time of the rise of Islam and the Islamic invasion of the Visigothic kingdom in Spain, which by that point was then Christian. Okay? But one thing you need to understand here is that the various different groups that you see on the map before you, these various kind of broad lines of movements and migrations and invasions, the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and the Vandals are all predominantly, and certainly at least among their kings and nobility, Aryans by this point in history. Okay? So they're no longer Germanic pagans, worshipping Woden and Thor and Freya and everything else that comes with that. They have adopted the Aryan heresy. Okay? So they look and sound similar, but with the notable difference that they utterly and flat out reject the eternal divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ. And this is, of course, the very heresy which the first two ecumenical councils spent umpteenth amount of time dealing with. It's the very heresy which St. Athanasius the Great spent his entire life fighting against, including the 5 times he was exiled by various different elements and peoples, either allying themselves with the Arians or being bought out by the Arians or being blackmailed by the Arians and various other things that, of course, went on during those days. These are the peoples, and it is a terrifying prospect and combination, especially for Christians living in the western provinces of the empire, okay? Because, and this is an extremely important thing to understand about the way that the European world is being reshaped during this time, is that it is in the form of the various Gothic or more broadly Germanic tribes in these days, again 5th century particularly, that you have a very terrifying combination of elements. Arianism, and the most dangerous and prolific heresy that's ever assailed against the church, combined with the prolific martial prowess of Germanic warlords and barbarians, as the Romans viewed them. Okay? Ferocity in battle and a barbarity upon the battlefield, for better or worse, combined with a brand new, very fresh devotion to their new religion. Okay? This is what is assailing against an old, tired, bureaucratically bloated, economically hyperinflated and strained, nationally and civically tired empire, right? With multiple different emperors, multiple different jurisdictions, even capital cities, speaking of jurisdictions, right? From the days of the death of Theodosius the Great in 395 to the formal end of the empire when the last emperor submits to Odoacer, king of the Ostrogoths, right, formally, and Odoacer is made king of Italy afterwards. That 80 years, basically, from 395 to 476, they have 4 different capitals in the west, of which Rome only spends about 27 years as the capital. Right? The main capital is actually Ravenna, which is a bit further north in northern Italy. The capital was moving around from places that weren't even Rome, okay? Bouncing around different administrative places, trying to strategically protect themselves from the onslaught of the various Gothic tribes. And of course, as you can note, if you look on the eastern side of that map to the Eastern Roman Empire, you see the city of Constantinople, okay, the city that Constantine built. By this time, of course, Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor, the one who came into more of our focus during the First Council of Nicaea in 325, he establishes what had been known in ancient times among the Greeks as Byzantium as a new Rome, what was called Nova Roma, right, the new Rome. He moves the capital formally from Rome to this new city of Constantinopolis, right, the city of Constantine, okay? And it is the capital of the unified empire and the capital then subsequently of the Eastern Roman Empire, and thankfully it was not invaded by the various Gothic tribes at this time. But in the West, even the capital, the ancient capital of Rome, is no longer the centre of the administrative life of the empire. All of this is to show you the kind of general environment of what's going on during this time, okay? And more importantly, the who, right? The who's are doing what, as it were, right? Who is doing what? And namely, you have this massive period of migrations and invasions and battles and wars and whatnot in and through, particularly and primarily and overwhelmingly, the western provinces of the empire, right? And so that brings us to 2 particular ones that are of note, especially at the hands of the same man, okay? One of the most powerful of the Germanic kings, the Germanic warlords, was Amalric, okay? Amalric, in this case, king of the Visigoths, right? Now, he, at one point, and you saw that on the map you had there, goes forth and invades one of the eastern provinces, or 2 of the eastern provinces technically, but invades Greece, okay, and barnstorms his way across Greece. He sacks multiple cities. He sacks Corinth, he sacks Argos, he sacks Sparta. He would have sacked Athens if Athens had not negotiated to pay him his weight in gold, as it were, for him to spare the city. But this famous 20th century painting is showing the great king of the Visigoths marching through Athens, right? This is a man whose ancestors hail from the northern Germanic lands of Denmark and Sweden, right? Now down in the Greek world. It's an entire clash of civilizations. It's a clash of disparate European tribes mashing and clanging in iron and blood together, right? So he even enters the ancient city of Athens. And as I said, fortunately Athens managed to negotiate a settlement with him to not burn the city to the ground, but many of the other ones, including Corinth, were ransacked by he and the Visigoths. Argos, Sparta, many others as well, as he blazed this trail of destruction through Greece, right? And what it brings us to most notably, and this was the most earth-shattering event clearly in this time, is so famous that even amidst other sackings, it just simply gets referred to as the sack of Rome, okay, in 410 AD. Right? The sack of Rome in 410 AD, okay? Again, at the hands of the Visigoths. Now, apart from it being Rome, what is the significance of this? There was only one time prior to this in the history of the Roman people in which a foreign army had ever entered Rome, and that was in 390 BC. Okay, when the Gauls, so the one of the major Celtic tribes from what today is France, so Western continental Europe, sacked Rome. Okay, has a famous account. The Gauls, the Gallics, demand mass amounts of gold and treasures, and the Roman senatorial class is loath to pay them off. There's one famous incident from that original sack of Rome in 390 BC in which they are weighing the amount, and each man, and at a certain point they actually made each man have to weigh specifically how much was to be paid. And in the midst of the senators and the other wealthy patricians of Rome understandably whinging and moaning about having to give up their hoard of treasure, one of the chieftains of that Gallic force takes his sword, throws it on the scales to tip the scales, and proclaims to them in Latin, "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished. In other words, you'll do what you're told. Right? You lost, we won, you will obey our commands. Right? That famous line, "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished, woe to the conquered, right, became so ingrained in the Roman psyche that even all these years later, these centuries later, if you asked any Roman about those words, they would know exactly what you were talking about. Right? It would be like people in broader Britannic nations like ours, or New Zealand, or America, or Canada, and various other places, referring back to things from World War II or from even the Napoleonic era, perhaps. Things like this of famous events and famous things. It was something ingrained in the Roman history and psyche. Every single Roman child knew of the one time in which foreign barbarians had ever stepped foot in Rome. And that was the last time that it had ever happened, until 800 years to the year, right? 390 BC to 410 AD. 800 years exactly, a foreign army successfully invades and sacks Rome and burns it much to the ground. Right? This famous painting, well, from 1890, should be on the front cover of your little one-page note there. Famous work, of course, from the Romantic era, 1890, showing the sack of Rome in 410. There are other subsequent minor sackings that happened, but none of them so devastating to the Roman psyche as this one. As I said, we just simply refer back to it as the sack of Rome in 410 because it was so infamous. The reason why this is so necessary to explain and is absolutely essential to understanding anything that we will then learn through the 6th, 7th, 8th century beyond, right, in the early Middle Ages, is because this event, although not the formal collapse of the empire, not the formal ending of the Western Roman Empire in a governmental, administrative sense, that will be later on, as I said, 476, 480, depending on which event historians choose, but at least 476. This event in 410, for the popular conscience, or consciousness, I should say, of the people of Rome, not just the city, but the world over, even in the East, which did not, other than through Greece, suffer at the hands of these Germanic invasions and sackings. Everyone the world over, even the enemies of Rome, among other Germanic tribes or among the Persianate lands off in the east, right, beyond the borders of Rome, like the Sassanids, which would later arise. Even the enemies of Rome were amazed and shocked by what had happened. It was the most world-breaking news in the history of the world up to that point, essentially. And that's genuinely true. We have historical records of this sacking from places as far as Hibernia, in other words, Ireland, which was never part of the Roman Empire, all the way across to India, and even certain examples in the Western lands of the Chinese dynasties. This was world-altering news because it was thought that ever since 390 BC, which was about 110 years, roughly speaking, more like 120 by that point, 120 years into the days of the Republic, right? The Roman Republic, Rome transitioned from a kingdom to a republic in 509 BC. This is now 390, so as I said, about 120 years into this youngish republic. That sack happens. The Roman army then succeeds in defeating those Gauls, subjugating them and conquering them, and then the Roman Empire just expands and expands and expands and expands. Never since that, or even the near loss to the great Hannibal Barca, the general of the Carthaginian Empire, had Rome ever had this happen because, and that's what I'm saying about the news, to understand the mentality of the people, including Christians in the 5th century, early 5th century. Rome was understood and believed to be Aeterna Roma, the eternal Rome, the eternal city. Okay? Rome was thought to be, well, not thought to be, it was officially called Caput Mundi, the capital of the world, because by all general standards it was, certainly effectively, not so much these days, obviously, by the time you get to 410, but nevertheless, it's the heart of the Roman people who get their name from the very city-state that they once descended from. And the fact that it was sacked and a foreign army invaded it, broke through the walls, defeated the Roman army, and destroyed monuments, littered the streets, raped and pillaged through population centres, burnt major institutions and other such grandeur of architecture to the ground, although not churches, interestingly enough, more on that next week. This was an event which brought about a definitive visual proof that no one could deny of the existential crisis that not just Roman people faced, but everyone in the orbit of the Roman people faced. For the enemies of Rome, it was a sign of something that was thought to be previously impossible, which was that even Rome could be sacked, which of course only further emboldened the Germanic tribal confederations. It was something that for the inhabitants of Rome, be they literal Romans themselves or other people who were culturally Roman, who were Romano whatever, like Romano British, for example, or Romano Gallic or Romano Hispanian, blah, blah. It was something that was thought of as, in some cases, actually some writings, as equally traumatic as learning that your mother had been despoiled, right? That your mother had been assaulted, right? And you get my drift. That was the understanding and the view. It was an absolute existential crisis that can't even really compare to anything today. Even regardless of any other details, at least just in terms of the culturally shocking nature of the reverberation that happened during 9/11, for example. Right? As world-breaking news as that was, it's not happening in a city that was thought to be unattackable, unassailable, for an empire that has conquered the world, at least not in the way that the Romans did. There is no way of even comparing it necessarily to anything today that would have the same weight and gravity as what the sacking of Rome in 410 did for people all around the world in those days. These people are blaming that people are blaming this. I'll get more on that next week. So the pagans blame the Christians. This has happened to us because our emperors abandoned our gods, blah, blah, blah. It is the event which precipitates and causes directly St. Augustine to write what is universally regarded as his greatest work, his magnum opus, which is, as I said already, Civitas Dei, the city of God. He writes it as a direct theological response to this event, and that work, and we're going to go through all of it because it would take probably 8-10 lessons to go through, but that work, the city of God, which I do recommend to you obviously, is dealing with deep historical, metaphysical, theological concepts to try and give Christians who are watching the entire world come to an end, which is what they absolutely believe, get through that, right? Because as far as everyone just about in the world is concerned, even among the pagans, this is the end of the world. And I don't mean it in like the figurative kind of hyper-emotional dramatic sense. I mean like quite literally. They absolutely believed and were convinced this was the end of the world. Because even if Rome fell, then what else would fall? In fact, actually, St. Augustine quite literally says that. He says, if even Rome can perish, then what's stopping anything else, to paraphrase, right? That's a paraphrase quotation from St. Augustine. And it's that exact mentality. Even if I give you a taste, again, we'll talk about more next week, but even if I just give you a taste of what this sentiment was very much like, this is a quotation from, as you can see, one of St. Jerome's letters to Principia. He wrote this a little under 2 years after the sacking in 412 AD. Okay? Quote here from St. Jerome. St. Jerome, at this time, just so brief mentioning, we touched on him briefly in passing in the early church course. St. Jerome, most famous for his translation of the scriptures into Latin, which of course is the language of the Western Empire. He's actually living in Bethlehem during this time. He lives in Bethlehem for almost 20 years roughly, while he's doing much of his translation work. Okay, the work that he produces is called the Latin Vulgate. Vulgate coming from the Latin term vulgaris or vulgar, meaning common tongue, not necessarily actually kind of what we associate with the term vulgar language, right? Common language. Becomes the Bible for the next 1,000 years, right? And is a on the whole good, almost great translation, and one that basically preserved Christianity in the West, right? So thank God for Jerome's work in translating into the language of the West that unified the people, which was Latin. But anyway, a quote from him whilst he's living in Bethlehem, which is quite a ways away from Rome, as you may well know. Quote, "A terrible rumour reached us from the West. Rome is besieged, and the price of her safety is gold. After taking away everything, the enemy rearms himself to demand more. The city," and this is the key line, the very famous key line from St. Jerome on this sack of Rome, ready? "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. Who could believe it? That Rome, built on her 7 hills, would perish by one fire. That she would become the sepulchre, in other words, the tomb of her people. That holy places would be defiled by the lust of barbarians. That's a quotation, as I say, from letter 127 to Principia, which he wrote about 2 years afterwards, right? This is the devastating news that reverberated around the entire world, right? You can kind of get that image of what I was talking about earlier, the existential crisis kind of, who could believe it? This is unthinkable. No one thought this could ever happen. That Rome could be taken, that Rome could be sacked, right? That the same events which happened 800 years prior, like as I said, literally to the year, was thought to be impossible, that it could never happen again, right? Well, it did happen again. It happened. It happened at the hands of the Arian Visigoths, right? Who eventually come to carve out an entire kingdom from the Roman province of Hispania, right? Spain, okay, and Portugal. This is the utterly devastating nature of what occurred. And so part of what we're wanting to understand in this kind of quick little 2-part fall of the Western Roman Empire portion is all of this absolute world-altering darkness of a backdrop, so it were, in which the early Middle Ages is born, okay, which is the first of the three different subsections, right? The early Middle, I'm going to use round numbers throughout this entire course because it keeps it nice and simple, right? The early Middle Ages, 500 to 1,000. The high Middle Ages, so the high point of the Middle Ages, 1,000 to 1250. The late Middle Ages, 1250 to 1500, okay? You can essentially think of it basically as 500 in and around the year of the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So basically the fall of the Western Roman Empire to the Reformation, right? That's generally speaking the Middle Ages, okay? Some would date it instead at different parts, and again, it doesn't look the same everywhere. In the East, it would be the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Again, another similar scenario. The city that was the jewel of the world, which was the largest city in the world for pretty much all of the Middle Ages, which was the New Rome and basically the capital of the world, which was thought to be equally unconquerable, even by the Muslims and the Mohammedans, right, was eventually taken by those very same Mohammedans in the form of the Ottoman Empire, right? Some would date it in other places to the completion of the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, the Spanish lands, which had been brought under the bloody and iron fist of the Islamic Caliphate of Al-Andalusia and others. That successful reconquest takes 700 years to complete. You'll get a good view on that when we talk about the Reconquista specifically. Because again, like the fall of the empire, another very important lesson for Christians to learn, and one of actually, in my opinion, even without any Spanish background, one of the most important lessons from the Middle Ages to learn is the fact that in the following onslaught of the Islamic Caliphates as they crossed the Pillars of Hercules, the Straits of Gibraltar, invaded Christian Spain, then eventually invaded Christian Francia, right, France, the southern half of it, and the famous events of Charles Martel and the Battle of Tours, all that later on. That happens, and the eventual fall of Christian Spain, as we retroactively refer to it, happens around the year 711 AD. It is not until 1492 that the Spanish kingdom is unified and they officially drive out the Muslims from Spain. It is 700 years that it takes for them to retake and reconquer those formerly Christian lands. 700 years of Islamic occupation. And each generation, never giving up, never giving up, never giving up, never giving up. You're going to learn about very famous instances which are biblical in every possible sense. You're going to learn about an army of 200 men who fight an army of, at the total, 150,000. They actually face physically 15,000 themselves on the day, and they win. You'll learn about that. You'll learn about everything it took, and of course 1492, for those of you who are history buffs, you know that is the beginning of the Spanish Empire. The Spanish lands, of course, unify with the marriage of Ferdinand II and Isabella of Castile and Leon, and they send a little Italian man, Christopher Columbus, across the oceans. More on that when we get to it. But anyway, back to this point, back to this point as we finish here today. The fall of the Western Roman Empire and its central, most shocking event, which is the sack of Rome. This is a time of desperation, a time of existential crisis. People, and especially Christians in the West, are not reading about ancient events. They are watching and witnessing live with their own eyes what they, to give them a fair shake, understandably perceive, not accurately, but understandably perceive to be the end of the world. Because their world is ending. The Roman world, at least in the West, in the imperial sense at which it had ever previously existed, even during the days of the Republic, where it was functionally an empire, right, was coming to a close. And that chapter of the history of the world, and Europe in this case particularly, was coming to a close. But it was to be replaced by something that would end up eventuating across the ages into far greater and higher achievements than Rome ever could have imagined. And we'll get onto that as we, of course, work our way through. So, that's the end for today. General understanding of kind of what certain events, people's said, death of Theodosius the Great, splits the empire formally, Western Roman Empire, Eastern Roman Empire as we refer back to it. between your son's succession crises, wars, invasions. We'll look at it again. More of the quotations is what we'll do next week in the part 2, and so you'll get a bit of a better contemporary understanding, as I say, from contemporary sources, like St. Augustine and others as well, who are living during that time, because it then will give us a good understanding of the black and bleak backdrop upon which the stars of the early Middle Ages begin to shine forth, as it were. Okay, so there we go. Thank you. Again, it's probably not much to there because it'll be that stuff. Any questions or anything need clarifying at all? If not, all good. Beauty. All right. Thank you.